I'm going to come to this, but what has been the experience the world over? A lot of people argue that given the fact that it's a finite resource, it's a scarce resource, the government should allot this or sell it in not just a transparent manner, but there have to be certain clear norms. Now, in different parts of the world, different norms have been used. In some cases, it's been just plain, simple, discretionary allotment. The government decides A, B, C, D should get it. The other way is sometimes described as a beauty parade. You invite a lot of people and ask them to bid for it. And the third auction, the third system is the public auction, where everybody bids for this scarce resource. Now, there have been arguments that the public auction route is not always the best route. Why? Because it increases prices, and this has been one of the arguments used by Mr. Raja to justify his earlier first come first served policy, which we can talk about in greater detail. But the argument is that if you have an auction, then people tend to bid up, and therefore once those prices go up, eventually the consumer has to pay for the higher price of spectrum, and therefore the argument is that maybe an auction system may not be the best system.
Let's first talk about what public policy ought to be. Okay. At the stage of development of a sector, of an industry, the public policy or the government policy will be different at different times. So let's say we are in 1990, the government policy is let us encourage telecom investments. So the argument there could be at that stage, when you are wanting to encourage telecom investors and have investors come into the sector, the argument could be let's make this more beauty parade because there are fewer people interested. Let's just figure out a way of giving it to them liberally. When the public policy has moved 20 years later to a policy where consumer benefit, maximizing the value of that asset to the exchequer so that that value can be used for building roads, hospitals, where the public policy has visibly shifted, there is no other alternative but to commercially auction these assets. This is true for spectrum, this is true for iron ore, this is true for any other asset, and I'll explain to you why. Think of India as a balance sheet. All of us as citizens of India own a piece of that balance sheet. On the right side, on the asset side, you have all of these limited assets. You have resources, minerals, spectrum. These are water, forest. These all belong to us and our future generations. If you give up one of those, if I take that and give it off to you, you must replace that asset with something else. Either cash, more hospitals, more roads, more
drinking water facilities, schools, etc.
If you apply that model to any argument that relates to a natural asset or a scarce resource, this argument becomes very simple to understand. You take away something, give it away to Mr. X, as a consequence of giving that to Mr. X, you must replace it.
Mr. X gives back something to society.
So that the balance sheet remains the same. You don't deplete India's balance sheet. You only replenish, you replace. You cannot have a public policy that says, I will give up an asset and I will not replace that with an equal or more valuable asset. That the day the public policy achieves that, the minister or the prime minister or the government that is overseeing that has done wrong.
Okay. Let's go back in time, since we are dealing with history. I mean, the great Indian telecom revolution is really a phenomenon of the 90s. But what happened was, initially, if you remember, when Mr. Sukhram used to be the telecom minister and the Congress party, Mr. Narasimha Rao's government was in power in Delhi, initially he sold licenses, he auctioned licenses, and people bid huge amounts of money. And even at that time, it was known that this money would never come to the government. And finally, when Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee became the Prime Minister, there were a series of changes in the telecom department. I think it was the only department which virtually every year there was a new minister. I mean, there was a whole string of people.
Correct.
And finally, even Mr. Jagmohan had to quit his position. Why? Because he said the companies should stick to their contractual obligations.
Correct.
But eventually, the government changed its policy
Correct.
from a licensing system to a revenue sharing system. Even the Attorney General of India, Mr. Soli Sorabji, changed his position. So, was that also not indicative of how the policy was wrong? Because if you want to auction circles and licenses, you might end up eventually having to change the policy.
That's exactly my point. I think the public policy at different stages of an evolution of a sector can go wrong. So if you start saying, I want commercial exploitation and maximizing resources at an early stage of development, let us say, for example, aviation. If you start imposing heavy license fees for aviation today, when they're all making losses, then it's a self-defeating sort of a situation. You will kill the industry and you will not get any resources as government either. So it is clear that in the late 90s, this whole direct auction model where people bid up a lot of money without having to demonstrate the money. So people actually bid and they were unfettered in the bidding because there was no stipulation in the auction process that you had to put money on the table, which is very different from the 3G process. Which
Absolutely, where you have clearly stated in writing
so
that you have to make your payments upfront.
Exactly. So therefore, there is a much more rational process of auction underway now than there was earlier. So this is all part of the learning process, that there are auctions and there are auctions. There are auctions that are doomed to fail and there are auctions that succeed. But going back to the earlier question that you made, and this is a very important point, because today in the papers I read a private operator saying that the high 3G licenses will automatically translate into high tariffs.
High costs to the consumer.
You know, this is one of the biggest myths and fallacies that has been propagated and perpetuated by people who are interested in either perpetuating a regime of high tariffs or don't want to pay the fair price for spectrum. And I'll explain to you why.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
This is an important point. I want you to discuss this in some detail.
Yeah.
Whether the intensification of competition itself is an important factor that could result in tariffs coming down to the consumer.
Sure.
I want to discuss this point with you in greater detail. I need to take a break in our program, and I'll come back to you. We are discussing valuation of electromagnetic spectrum, which are used by mobile telephone companies. We are discussing issues relating to why there's been such a huge controversy as to the manner in which second generation spectrum was allotted on a first come first served basis in January 2008. To discuss this and related issues with Rajiv Chandrasekhar, Member of Parliament, we take a short break and we get back to you.